As we at the Colson Center like to say, redemption is always personal, but it's never private. When we are restored in Christ, God gives us a work of restoration to do in the world. But no Christian is called to do that work alone. That's why we seek to build strategic partnerships with like-minded Christian organizations, like Focus on the Family, the Association of Christian Schools International, and more, to bring comprehensive worldview training to believers in every context, from Fortune 500 companies to middle school history classrooms. As we approach the end of our fiscal year, we need your help to continue strengthening our partnerships and bringing worldview training to more believers than ever. To partner with us in equipping Christians everywhere to live out their faith wherever God calls them, give today at colsoncenter.org/FYE23. Welcome to another episode of Further Upstream. I'm Shane Morris, here again with Tim Padgett to talk more about my conversation with Colin Hansen, Editor-in-Chief of the Gospel Coalition and author of a fascinating biography on the life and legacy of Tim Keller. That was the subject of our conversation, Tim Keller having just passed away last month. And I think there's a lot of sorting out and a lot of thinking about how to reach the American culture as Christians. And Keller had a distinctive approach and a lot of distinctive successes that make him, in many ways, a focal point, if not the focal point in certain circles on this conversation. So, Tim, welcome. I'm glad to have you. I loved this conversation, and I'm looking forward to talking more about Tim Keller.
Yeah, it has been, you and I are both PCA, and if people are familiar with PCA, we lost two kind of fathers of our faith within a day of each other. Harry Reeder from down in Birmingham, and then Tim Keller from up in New York. So two guys who kind of represented two different emphases, you might say, of kind of evangelism, of how you do things, more the standard approach and someone operating out of a very Southern culture down in Birmingham, and then the supposedly winsome approach, the word that gets tossed around, of Tim Keller in New York. And both of them had a great effect. I mean, my wife was converted under Campus Outreach, which was out of Harry Reeder's church, ultimately. And then so many other people who came to faith or renewed their faith through the efforts of Tim Keller.
I found it really interesting, Tim, that Colin contrasted Keller's approach and his style with what he called the previous generation's approach. So the Billy Grahams, and he actually put Chuck Colson in that category as well, because eventually both Graham and Colson became very comfortable with being adjacent to the levers of power. Obviously, Chuck came from the levers of power and had encounters, as we called them, which ended up with him going to prison and then coming out and founding Prison Fellowship. But it makes the juxtaposition I suggested at the beginning a little bit, well, it contrasts, because Chuck and Tim Keller obviously were drawing from the same tradition, this Kuyperian neo-Calvinistic tradition, but in a lot of ways, Colin's right to highlight the contrast there, because Keller seems to have had this strong aversion in many ways to the tactics and the instincts of a previous generation of evangelical Christian leaders. And then, of course, the thing that makes Tim Keller distinctive and for a long time just made him so central to the conversation in our circles and PCA, Presbyterian circles, is that unlike a Billy Graham, unlike even a Chuck Colson, who had many Reformed friends, Keller was one of our guys. He was a PCA guy, right? He was a Presbyterian, and he was a Presbyterian on the national stage in a way that I can't really think of other figures who had that stature for secular America. So a Billy Graham, obviously, this is a Baptist guy who's of this stature, but Tim Keller rises to a stature among secular Americans, among people who just read the New York Times and don't care about Christianity, that I'm not sure anyone else did. And for that reason, he became a spokesperson, not just for the PCA, but for Christianity and evangelical Protestantism as a whole. And that's the background to a lot of this. So I very much appreciated the distinctions that Colin was making on that front, because it helps to set up the conversation in a way that, well, explains why it is that after Tim Keller has finished his race here, we're still talking about the questions that his ministry and life raised, because it did raise a lot of questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think arguably, aside from someone like Billy Graham, who obviously is almost in a category by himself. I mean, Billy Graham arguably more than arguably, preached the gospel to more people than anyone else in history. He just did.
Well, there were also times when he was treated as like a de facto Protestant pope, because he standing there with the Pope, it's like, here's the best Protestant figurehead we can come up with.
And you watch his stuff, and like you see his sermons, and he had a remarkable gift. And the classic image of Billy Graham is him holding up the Bible, and there was some greatness to that. And that is a good lesson we have. He was not someone without controversy either. So he got some flack here and there about willing to associate with this or that person, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. But I think other than someone like Billy Graham, Keller's probably, in terms of someone accepted in elite American society, you have to go back to like J. Gresham Machen, who died in 1937, to meet someone who had that kind of status, not necessarily in the church, but in elite society. Actually, I did our breakpoint about Tim Keller. I wrote that a couple of weeks ago now. And one thing I noted was that he was mourned, obviously, by people like D.A. Carson, one of the best evangelical theologians there is right now. I refused to take him as a professor because he scared the living daylights out of me. He's absolutely intimidating, absolutely brilliant. Anyhow, this is a top-level theologian, and he is remembering his friend, Tim Keller. But you also have, in the New York Times, David Brooks. You have the New Yorker. You have all these elite organizations who are talking about him. And that says something. He was able to touch something that a lot of other Christians have not been able to do. And I think that, I don't remember if it was you or Colin who mentioned that they didn't talk about his controversy. They didn't talk about this stuff. They didn't talk about him compromising. They didn't say he made it palatable by watering it down. They said he preached the gospel, kind of thing. I loved actually David Brooks' comments. He said that he was a recliner. He said that whenever they would be having these conversations, Keller would be kind of literally sitting back, kind of like I am here now. But that's just because the chair leans back. He would kind of lean back and then make his comments, and it'd be these brilliant things. One teeny tiny pushback I would have towards Colin's comment about the generational thing. I think he has a point, but something to bear in mind. Keller was born in 1950. Colson was born in 1930. Billy Graham was born in 1918. Those are, while there might be a generational thing, to put Colson and Graham together, I wouldn't necessarily do that. There's a bit more going on there. So I think he has a point, but it needs to be broadened. I think Colson is someone who is on the receiving end of the teaching of people like Billy Graham and Carl Henry. And then Tim Keller, on the other hand, coming up even after that. Of course, Keller, going from what Colin said, Keller came to Christ in, 68, 69, somewhere in there. And our dear Colson was doing other things at that time, as we've mentioned. He was not quite in the faith yet. So that shows there's going to be the generational thing. But I wonder how much when you came to faith, not just your age, but when you came to faith, plays a role.
When I look back and try to remember when it was I first encountered the name Tim Keller and I first started to consume his resources, I think that it was a number of articles and videos before I started reading his books. But the thing that stands out to me is that Tim Keller was the Reformed guy who gave me permission to import C.S. Lewis, who I already loved. And so it was like this connection, because someone like an R.C. Sproul, obviously, I think he was positively disposed toward Lewis in many ways, but he didn't mention him a lot, right? He didn't talk about him or use his arguments or cite him or draw connections between Christian theology and apologetics and beauty and mythology, the way that Lewis did. That Sproul's wheelhouse was definitely very different. Along comes Tim Keller into my thinking and reading and just contemplation of Christianity, and he starts immediately citing Lewis, and then he starts citing people from other branches of Christianity and just drawing them together in this very, Catholic little c, but this very cosmopolitan way. As a thinker, he's been other places besides the Reformation corner. There was something to that really resonated with me, and then gave me, I guess, internally permission to lean forward into Lewis and say, no, really, for real, Lewis is awesome. I don't have to be ashamed that I like C.S. Lewis. And there are other friends of mine who had that same experience. It was like, well, Lewis is okay for fantasy and children's stories, but really, when it comes to serious theology, you need to read Francis Turretin instead. And that's still true if you want reformed systematic theology, right? You got to find somebody like a Bavinck or a Turretin or something like that. But I mean, heck, even John Frame goes to places that C.S. Lewis was not going to go to. Nevertheless, Keller connected things in a way that made that possibility open and live for me. And then he actually updates and uses many of Lewis's stratagems in his work. And so I remember at one point realizing, okay, if somebody were going to talk to me about Christianity and they were a skeptic or a seeker, who was open to earnest conversation, and they asked me for a book recommendation, I would go to Mere Christianity and Keller's Reason for God. And I remember realizing I will hand them Reason for God first, because it's addressed directly to the concerns of my time and my generation. Whereas Lewis is speaking to the concerns of a different time and generation. And I'll tell you where this comes in, Tim, is when Lewis is writing, and this comes out in Abolition of Man too. When Lewis is writing, he's writing to people who have relativized morality so much that they want to view it as entirely subjective. In fact, he's answering subjectivists in Abolition of Man. When Keller writes, he is self-consciously writing and in many ways anticipating the rise of what we would call the Puritans or the social justice warriors, right? Or the SJW phenomenon is one that, as Chris Leland, who was with Colorado Christian for a long time, liked to say, these people thunder moral pronouncements. They have deep moral convictions, and they believe they're universal. They think those claims actually hold for everybody, right? And Keller was writing to them, and he basically says, you believe some moral stuff really strongly. And Lewis does this too. He's like, you believe somebody steps on your toe, they should apologize, right? Well, Keller takes that into the big meta level moral claims that millennials and Gen Z were making and says, you believe in social justice. You believe that exploitation of the poor and the marginalized and the outcast is wrong. Well, guess what? You need to actually start to justify those beliefs, and you need to ground them somewhere. And you can't do that without invoking immaterial rules and laws. And well, guess what? Christianity is the best place to get those from. So you need to start doubting your doubts, because things aren't as obvious as you think they are. In that way, he pairs well with a Glenn Scrivener or someone like that, who's going to make this case years later. And then, of course, you've got works like Prodigal God and The Meaning of Marriage, and he explores these concepts in a way that just has so much heart to it and gets you to see things for the first time in a way that's very unfamiliar, and unfamiliar in a good way. And this leads into some of the areas where I would hesitate or even criticize his approach. Little old me, who the heck am I? But I think I'm on solid ground there. Like when he pits the concept of the gospel against religion, right? And treats those as antithetical. I didn't like that. I thought that was not a good way. Like, religion's a perfectly good word, and I'm not willing to sacrifice it. It's in the title of John Calvin's best known work, for goodness sake, And I was reading
it's in the book of James.
Yeah, it's in the book of James. The translation that I'm reading of Augustine's Confessions, he mentions it positively. He's positively disposed toward religion. It's a good thing. So I don't want to sacrifice that word. But that was a byproduct of an overall good approach that Keller had, which was to try to make things seem unfamiliar and fresh to his secular or doubting readers. He had a posture. He had a heart for the deeply morally instinctive person in the urban, educated spheres where he spent the latter part of his career. But he wanted them to think more deeply and to start to question the prejudices they have against these benighted religious backwoods fundamentalist types, and just realize, no, actually, our tradition is the one that you're drawing from, and you need to reckon with that and be more serious about your prejudices against faith, against, dare I say it, religion, because you are acting quite religiously yourself. Have you thought about why? And that's just a wonderful posture, because it catches people off guard. I think caught a lot of people off guard in his ministry.
Yeah, I think that probably the thing in your conversation with Colin that struck me is like the keenest insight that Colin brought forward was how things have changed simply in New York City. He was talking about the context of things. And he said that 50 years ago or more, people were saying, kind of progressive, liberal Christians, let's say. Liberal Christians at the time were saying, well, we need to keep the morality of Christianity because everybody recognizes that's right, but we got to dump the supernatural stuff. Whereas now, people are fine with having all the whatever quirky supernatural stuff you want, completely mutually nonsensical supernatural things, but it's the morality that people object to. I thought that was one of the keenest things Colin brought out. It reminded me, and I put this in my notes, that has been a shift in culture in so many ways. In Francis Schaeffer's first majorly popular book, The God Who Was There, I think it's in The God Who Was There, he talks about the fact that if you told a girl a generation before his time, so we're talking 1940 or something like that, a generation before he's writing, if you told her to be a good girl, she might not agree with you, but she knows what you mean. Whereas now, around 1970, 1968, when he's writing there. He says, if you say that, you'll get a blank look because she won't understand what you mean. Now, 50 years on, 53 years on, or 50, however long it's been, if you say, be a good girl, you are going to get accosted. People are going to punch you. They're not going to be blank about that. And so I think that it goes to your point about how highly moralistic we are, that we live in a world that's has not rejected morality. What it tried to. It tried to reject morality. We've rejected any sort of structure or fundamental meaning, but we have to have that morality. And this isn't actually a criticism of what Colin said. He was talking about how existentialism, people don't talk about that anymore. He's right. People don't talk about that anymore. I have a whole shelf of Camus and Sartre books because I'm weird, but most people, that's not what they're dealing with. However, I think people are living out the lessons of people like Sartre and Camus. For those of you who are not quite familiar with existentialism, it's a mid-20th century philosophical movement, largely out of France. Broadly speaking, it argues that there is no meaning in the world. We live in a world that has no meaning. There is no God. However, as a human being, you must create a sense of meaning, a supreme act of the will. I think that's the moment we're living in. People aren't reading Sartre. People aren't reading Camus. They're not reading Kierkegaard. However, they as human beings have been told their whole lives that life is meaningless. Absolutely meaningless. But they know deep inside that there has to be something right and something wrong. Because when they see a child being abused, they know something's wrong with that. When they see oppression, when they see theft, when they see unwarranted invasions, like we've seen recently, they know something's wrong with this. But they don't have a basis for saying so. And that's where people like Schaeffer, like Keller come in. Despite the fact that Keller and Schaeffer, well, of course, they're both Presbyterian, so we like that. Despite the fact that they're very different in so many ways, they had a common approach, and that is to meet people where they were, to talk to people where they were. Now, Keller is drawing from Lewis. He's drawing from Catholic sources. He's drawing stuff like that. Schaeffer's drawing not so much from other denominations. He was pretty secular about denominations at times. But he's drawing from, well, existentialist things. He's drawing from avant-garde cinema. He's drawing from all these things. And they're each saying, you believe that, in Schaeffer's time, there must be justice, and therefore you're a communist. You believe there must be a higher thing, therefore you're a hippie. Where today, more recently, Keller's saying you believe that social justice matters, but why do you believe it? And Schaeffer often talked about the importance of walking with people. One of my favorite things about him is that he would be, someone called him grimly sectarian. That's an exaggeration. But the thing is, he would weep with people. And you get the impression that Keller was that sort too. Seems a little bit more cerebral. So not necessarily physically weeping with someone, but he was there with people. And I think that whatever mistakes you may want to say that they had, they were meeting people where they were. And I put this in my notes. It exemplifies so much of what you see even in the book of Acts. One of my mentors at Covenant Seminary, Jaron Bars, he emphasized this. When you look at the stories of Paul's evangelism, even within just a few chapters, within the same missionary journey, he's at Pisidian Antioch, he's at Lystra, and then he's at Athens, one right after another. And there's a little bit of episodes between. But he has entirely different forms of speech in each one. When he's talking to the Jews, he uses scripture and cites the Old Testament and draws on this long tradition, this long history, because he knows they will know what he's talking about, and that will meet them where they are. He's talking to ordinary pagans in Lystra, and they're about to sacrifice to him because they think he's Hermes, right? He talks in terms of nature and the beauties of nature because they get that. And that, again, that's going to draw them to the gospel. And then he's talking to the elite philosophers of the day in Athens, best equivalent to New York as you could imagine right now. He's there talking to these Athenians, and he's quoting the Epicureans. He's quoting the Stoics. He's citing all these poets. Very different things. But each of them has the same goal, to take them from where they were to where they needed to be. To say, yes, you're right about this, but let me show you the truth behind it. It's almost a reiteration of Christ's constant phrase, right. You have heard it said, but now I tell you.
One of the things
so much of evangelism
confronted
needs to be rooted
people
in that
about the impressions
phrase.
Or false impressions they had of Christianity was that you have heard it said, Christians consider themselves more righteous and holy than everyone else, and they get together in church to have a righteous club and be holier than thou. But I tell you that the reason we're here is because we're the ones acknowledging openly in our liturgy, in our worship, in our scripture readings, in our sermons, that we are sinners, that we need help, And he said the world is not divided between the righteous and the unrighteous. The world is divided between sinners who know they are sinners and are reckoning with that fact and asking God for forgiveness and justification and sanctification and help, and those who are still pretending that they're righteous. But there's nobody who's actually in the righteous category, not objectively speaking. I mean, that's just so disarming and so helpful. It reminds me of something that actually Rich Mullins said. He would do these like speeches off the cuff at his concerts. And one of the things he said is that he goes, I'm just here playing songs for you guys, but you need to go to church. Like seriously, this Sunday, you need to go to church because I know I need to go to church because I'm a sinner. And if you're not a sinner, then, well, hey, you can go jogging on Sunday morning with all the other perfect people. But the people who are going to church, they're the ones they're going because they need help. They know they're sinners, right? And that's what we're doing. What do you think we do at church? It's ask for God's help, and we desperately need it, right? And that's one of the things that Tim said. And I think that, however it is that secular people got the impression in America, especially, this is the context I know, right, that to be religious, to declare yourself religious, is to declare yourself righteous and having it all together and better than everyone, holier than thou, right? That's an impression that I vividly recall coming up against almost every time that I talk with a secular person. There were even contexts immediately out of high school, Tim, where people would kind of jokingly, I was in this one secular youth government organization, and I did some graduate advisor work afterwards, and people would do this thing where they would, they'd have a drink or they'd tell a dirty joke or something like that. And then they'd say, "Oh, sorry, can't say that in front of Reverend Shane. It'll damage his delicate religious sensibilities." And I'm just like, guys, nothing you're saying is surprising or shocking or offending me in the way you're thinking. As I'm not a delicate soul who needs to be protected from this stuff. I do have beliefs, and I wish that you wouldn't do things that I consider, damaging and destructive to your soul. But I'm not like some innocent flower who needs to be protected for your secularity and your ways of life. And that's surprising to people. I guess it was surprising when Tim Keller told them that we're not the people who think we have it all together. We're the people who are openly admitting and dealing with our problems. How are you dealing with your problems? And it just swept them off their feet. It just totally, like a jujitsu move or a hapkido or something. I don't know which martial art. The one where you do the hook with your heels and sweep someone off their feet. That's kind of the thing he did. And there's a great effectiveness to that. However much you might quibble with, some of his stances about politics and so forth, I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt that we're going to get into the kingdom, Tim, and we're going to find that there are legions of people who are there because they read Tim Keller or they listened to Tim Keller's sermons or they encountered him and went, "Ooh, okay, this guy's not a dummy. He's got something that is not like the stereotypes I've heard about Christians. I think I might need to listen a bit more and then doubt my doubts," like he said.
I think that there is something, the word usually has a negative connotation. I think that the best form of Christianity is going to be subversive. That is, it's going to have a confrontational element. It's going to have a you need to change your ways element. But it's also going to be a get around your defenses element. It's going to be a get people to question their questions, to doubt their doubts. I think that has to be a key thing. I had similar experiences in my, you might say, previous life. Before coming to the Colson Center, I waited tables for 20-something years. That if you haven't been in the restaurant world, it is not a moral place. It is, someone said that restaurants are places where all the cooks are on drugs and all the servers are having relations with one another. And that's not far.
My sister was a hostess, and it almost destroyed her faith in humanity forever.
Absolutely. Between your coworkers and the people who come in, you would know, anyone who is not a Calvinist should go wait tables for a while. And one way or the other, they recognize the total depravity of humanity. But it was just, the language was awful, in particular since there was the hypocritical element, because the whole thing is a show, right? You go and you smile. There's a moment in the movie Waiting with Ryan Reynolds. It is not. I cannot recommend the movie because it's very foul-mouthed, but let's just say it's accurate. And there's a moment where there's this young woman who's waiting the tables, and she's smiling and talking to the table, and this is great. She goes around the corner, her face immediately falls into a scowl, and she's just this foul-mouthed thing. That's the world. Okay, that's the world that I was living in for like 20 years. And people sometimes would say that same thing they said to you. "Oh, you're going to be shocked." I'm like, guys, I've been waiting tables for years. I know what this is like. And I think that we have to remember that's the world. How is it we can reach those people in that world? How can we bring those people to Christ? And sometimes it's going to mean calling people out. Sometimes it's going to mean, yeah, you're right. That's when the after church crowd comes in, they're jerks. We need to acknowledge that. We have to be able to say that. But it also means being subversive. There's this one guy, Brian something or another in Chicago, and he asked me why I never called him out about various sins and stuff he did. I'm like, well, for one thing, you're not a Christian. I don't expect you to follow Christian morality. Also, if I come at you every time you do something wrong, are you likely to come to me if you then have a real problem? And he was like, good point. And I think that has to be part of what we do. There is a time to call people out, but it's the whole thing of that you can get more people, attract more flies with honey than vinegar. You got to have the vinegar. You and I write constantly about things that are wrong in society and talking about how they're bad. But I think part of it is we need to distinguish between saying thus and such element in society, thus and such policy that's been put forward, this argument, this is wrong and this is bad and here's why. But there's a difference between saying that and saying you are awful, because you and I both know that we are awful too. And I think that's what you can bring. That's what we can learn from Keller. And I think the beauty of something, the methods of someone like Keller, is that if someone were to say, "Oh, he doesn't make any mistakes," he'd be like, "You're wrong. Of course I do." He doesn't. He never struck me as being someone who would think that he'd gotten it all right all the time. And that's one of the right things about it. We look throughout history. You look through the Bible. How many people in the Bible are flawless? I don't even mean literally flawless like Christ, but in terms of how they are portrayed. You've got Joseph, who's a little bit of a snot, but he doesn't have no gross sin. Daniel doesn't have much, but other than that, and
Elijah got hangry one time.
That's true. He did get hangry.
Other than that,
yeah, he does lose. But yes, that's one of my favorite moments. But yeah, in terms of people who are talked about more than a line, or like what is his name, Ehud, the judge who stabs through the guy's gut, and that's a wonderful story. Anyone who has spoken of it at any length is shown with great flaws. Anyone in church history, Martin Luther, you and I love Luther. You and I love Calvin. They were screw-ups. They messed up. They shouldn't have burned Servetus. Luther shouldn't have said half the things he said. But the church was greatly benefited by this. And I think that much of the controversy around Keller is a mistake of two things. One, expecting him to be perfect, something he never really would have claimed to be. And two, misunderstanding that context matters. Like I said about Paul and things like that, Keller was ministering to a particular group of people in a particular city at a particular time. That is not going to play out at all times in all history. I put in my notes there that, Paul's, we think of the early church and you think of the different approaches that Peter and Paul and John and so on have. That's back then, and that's a much smaller world in so many ways. The Roman Empire was, I actually had to look this up before I sent it to you. The Roman Empire was 2 million square miles at its height. The United States, not the world, the United States is 3.5 million square miles. That's huge. There were about 70 million people in the Roman Empire. There's 330 million people in America. There's going to be so much diversity. There's going to be something that will work very well in a particular context, New York City around 2000, that is not going to work in Kansas. And that's nothing wrong with either of them. And I think we have to recognize that those different contexts matter. Just as Paul changed, people need to change that. But also people change. You and I are going to approach the same issue. I mean, you and I have worked together for years now. We're going to come at the same issue differently. And that's okay. And the thing is, it's quite possible that one or both of us is wrong on that. And it's just, we have to continue the simple referendum thing. We have to keep honing ourselves, iron sharpening iron with one another, and being humble to acknowledge that, confident enough to say, here's why I think I'm right, but humble enough to say I could be wrong, and to have that dynamic with one another in the wider world. I think that social media has really done a number, and I put some of that stuff in my notes. I think it's really affected the way we viewed things. I think that much of the controversy over Keller can be rooted to social media because, again, what was going on there around the year 2000, 20 years ago, isn't going to be applied. Social media convinces us that we live in this abstract place, this cosmopolis where everything's the same. It isn't. What is the need here in Colorado is not going to be the need. My home of Tennessee is not going to be the need in Paris. The gospel needs to go everywhere. It's going to change how we say it in each place.
Yeah, I can vividly recall moments with Tim Keller's social media accounts, especially the Twitter, where people would be jumping all over him for something that got posted there. And I would kind of cringe, and then I would tell them, guys, look, I've read the book where this comes from. You're taking it in the wrong way. I know that isolated, it could be taken that way, but that's not what he does with it. You're just getting sort of the slogan form of the lengthy argument that he makes that gets him there. You need to be careful, but because you're misconstruing it. I'm not saying it's wise to just throw context-free statements out there on social media. Probably not the wisest thing at the end of the day, but you do need to take the time to actually understand what he's saying there, because it's not what you think he's saying in a lot of cases. On the other hand, I really appreciated that Colin identified really the major juncture of disagreement on a lot of stuff, but with Keller and those to his, I guess, his theological or at least political right, or at least those who perceived themselves that way rhetorically and socially. And that is that he placed evangelism first. He thought evangelism was the first priority of the church. And Colin made this explicit. I think it's something that you could glean as an implication from Tim Keller's ministry and his life and his work, but that's explicit. And he actually said he checked this multiple times with Tim Keller. And Keller said, yes, I would say evangelism is the highest priority of the church. I'm not sure I agree with that, but it's very helpful to know where he's coming from, because that gives a lot of background and context to when he would write op-eds about why there's problems on the left and there's problems on the right. And yeah, sure, there are problems on the left and problems on the right. And Jesus doesn't have a political party. Like, he got in a lot of trouble for saying this kind of thing. There is no political party for Christianity. We're not wed to a political party. Well, of course, I think everybody does agree with that. But what does that mean? Does that mean a kind of equal ultimacy between the parties? Like, we have no more disagreements or agreements with this side than we do with that side. Or abortion as an issue is on the same level morally as like universal health care or something like that. Okay. I don't think that's true, but I can see how you would take that implication or that tenor from some of the things that Keller wrote. And that's an area where actual disagreement is going to flower forth. I think probably you can be charitable about the way you deal with that stuff, and those controversies are had. I look back on the last few years and I think they were not had well. It was just not done well. There was very little communication. And this guy who early on was identified as, what I looked at Tim Keller and identified him as this, wow, okay, this guy is taking a highly conservative and orthodox theological convictions into a setting where they've just never thrived before. And he's absolutely making them sound credible and just knocking down the misconceptions people have. To just a few years later, people in, I guess, what I consider adjacent to me in my circles, looking at Tim Keller and being like, that's the far left of the PCA. Like, Keller is pushing it on the left. And it's so odd and jarring. And I'm not sure it's accurate at all to who he really was and what he really believed. But again, it all comes back to, there's this conviction that what should our first priority be? It should be to adopt a posture that invites people into Christianity. Now, I don't think Keller would have ever said for a moment we compromise our beliefs on that basis, but the way things are presented change because of that. If you were to ask me, again, little old me, here's just, me with the podcast, my instinct would be the church's first duty is to worship God, right? It is the worship of God. And so every service of the church, every Sunday morning worship doesn't have to be an evangelistic rally. We don't have to sing Just As I Am and have an altar call at the end of everyone, because what's happening here is
we're not Baptist.
Right. It's I know, I grew up Baptist. Every head bowed, every eye closed, I see that hand, there we go. Praise the Lord. Come up afterwards and we'll give you some materials. And I saw the same people go forward every time, whatever. We're not going to go there. But the posture does change if you think that the top priority here is to worship God and not to make sure that unbelievers who might be here get the right impression. And Keller was a master expository preacher. So he obviously thought that the preaching of the word of God and the sacraments and the worship of the people of God were massive priorities as well. But in his public presence, you can tell he's foregrounding evangelism. He's foregrounding inviting people in. And I think probably when he saw political stances made in an aggressive or a way that, I want to put this carefully, but political stances placed so high on our priorities, justice issues is what Colin called them. So abortion is the biggest example of this, that we end up just driving people out the door immediately. So instead of ever getting to the gospel, we get to, oh, you're pro-choice? Well, bye. That sort of thing. What do we deal with first? Do we deal with the existence of God and sin and salvation and who is Jesus and did he rise from the dead? Or do we deal with, are you pro-choice or pro-life? That's a real tension. That is a real tension because, I think that's the most important justice issue of our time. But do I shut people out immediately on that litmus test? I don't know. But it seems like Keller had his answer, which was, no, I'm going to invite you in. I'm going to start preaching the gospel to you. And then we'll have that discussion at a later juncture. So, but you can see how that plays out. And I deeply appreciated that Colin identified where it is that those with different instincts from Keller parted ways.
Yeah, when you were talking about that Keller has the emphasis on evangelism, you were going to have the emphasis on worship, things like that. And I'm not necessarily going to say one's right, one's wrong on that. What it reminds me of is when I was in seminary, you had all those groups. It's about the Sunday morning worship, and that's the whole shebang, the song, the liturgy, that kind of emphasis. Not necessarily a high church liturgy, just that's the focus. Others have, it's the didactic teaching element. Others have, it's the evangelistic element. Others have, it's the social justice element. Others have, it's the counseling and dealing with the healings of the sins of life element. All those things are good. All of those things are wonderful. And again, I'm not going to get into rating those right now, but I think that it's very easy for each of us. Each of us is going to have a predilection towards one of those or another, one way or the other. If for one thing, it's a personality thing, just how our lives have been, but also there's only 24 hours in a day. We can't devote all of our time to all things. We can say that you, Shane, are a bit of a Renaissance man because you do all this theology stuff and you do the podcast and you go swimming for shark teeth. Okay, that's impressive. That really is impressive because most people can't have those two levels of expertise or multiple things like that. And so we see the same thing in the church where people have these different emphases. And I think that when people who have a social justice emphasis, they're going to look at Keller and say he's got the wrong priority. They're going to say you're absolutely wrong. They're going to say to what you said, that abortion being the central issue, they're going to say, oh, that's just crazy. That is not the central issue. It's women's rights. It's racial justice. It's whatever. Fill in the blank. And I think that we're going to have that. Have that element again and again where our different giftings, our different callings that God has brought us to, our different situations we find ourselves in. That's where a lot of this controversy boils down to. You have a lot of people who are trying to serve God, and they found this is the way I'm going to serve God. Keller found his way. And I think by and large, he was right. I don't agree with everything he did. You don't agree with everything he did. We don't agree with anything everybody does, right? It's having that humility. I think that I put in my notes there, what I appreciated about your conversation with Colin was that y'all were approaching him with perspective. Keller with perspective. And I think that's Keller's great gift, is that he wasn't caught up in the immediacy of the social media conversation. Because as Colin noted, Tim Keller was from a previous generation. He was 24 years older than I am. So a whole generation older than I am. And he's bringing in a different kind of conversation than what you and I would bring. And I think that we have to have those things. I just want to go back to the simple referendum thing again, that we have to keep checking and keep checking and keep checking. And I think that Keller did a pretty good job at that. Not always perfectly, but I think he sets a good example of someone doing it well and someone living well, preaching well, and in the end, they're dying well. So I think despite his criticisms that people can level at him, I think he's definitely a good example of someone who we can imitate him as he imitates Christ.
Yeah. I want to close by talking about what you just said, his dying well. And this is a contrast because I opened up my conversation with Colin by referring back to watching Chuck fall ill and die. And it happened so suddenly. It was like, boom. I mean, he went out on his feet essentially. And he was doing the thing that he was called to do. With Tim Keller, it was entirely different because he had this lengthy battle with pancreatic cancer. And there was a long time there where he had basically made public, I am in my last days. I have received what is in essence a terminal diagnosis, barring some sort of radical change. And he was just aware of it. And then he lived his life in light of that. And he spoke in light of that. And he wrote in light of that. And he conducted his relationships in light of that. And the amount of courage and confidence and the trust that he had that Jesus was waiting for him, that he was going to finish his race well. I mean, in one sense, I admire and just am in awe of it. But in another sense, I envy that sort of thing, because so many people, I guess, you go and you don't know when your time was. But for him, he had this beautiful opportunity to get it so right at the end. And he got it so right. And he just modeled, like, I guess it's Paul's second epistle to Timothy, is where he gives those beautiful farewell words. I've fought the fight, I've run the race. And he's like, he knows this is going to be his last missive to Timothy, essentially. That's the sort of thing that Keller was doing toward the end of his life there. And I think it's so important and beautiful, especially in a time when whole swaths of our culture are basically deciding this dying thing is not something that's worth doing. Any of the struggles and pains and difficulties and humiliation that goes with it, we're not going to do that. We're out. Assisted suicide, physician-assisted suicide, or as it's euphemistically called today, medical aid in dying, MAID, right? And Canada has gone so far into this that it's like a macabre joke. It's like, here are your options. You can either seek treatment for this and be on a waiting list for the next 10 years, or you can go ahead and kill yourself. And here's the cheap, easy, quick option. And that is just...
Even for poverty.
Yeah, even for poverty or mental illness or something like that. And the sense that life with a terminal diagnosis or life with hardship is worth living, and that it can be lived gloriously and well, and you can finish the race in that beautiful way and claim that crown of laurels, or the crown of glory for which you're running. All this Pauline language, it's just so lost on us. And maybe secular people, maybe non-believers don't have the resources to even say something like that. I guess you could look at a Jordan Peterson, or someone who takes a more existential stance on things and says, like you were saying earlier, yes, life is meaningless, and yes, there's nothing awaiting us but the blackness, but we're just going to live well anyway, because we're going to choose to do that. It's like an existential rage against the darkness kind of thing. But Christians actually do have a ground for hope, not only in this life, but in the next. And we don't mourn as those who have no hope. And Keller modeled that beautifully. And man, do I hope and pray that at the end, I will have a chance to put out a fraction of the goodness and confidence and witness that he had there at the end. I mean, I don't even know where to start, just everything he wrote about it. There was a reflection, I'm trying to remember whether it was in the Times or it was in some other major publication, and it was just about this. It was just about that he wrote about having a terminal diagnosis and getting ready to die. And he was so calm about it. And I think so many people had just admired that, because everything about his approach was nothing about it, rather, was like sugar candy mountain. I'm trying to remember that Orwellian phrase, right? Nothing about it was that. It was like, I am going somewhere that I'm so confident is real that it's going to make this world look like a dream. It's like stepping into the true Narnia. That was his attitude. And from what I know, that was his attitude right down to the bottom, right down to the personal bedside. I mean, that was real. It wasn't a public thing. That's beautiful. Man, do we need more of that.
Absolutely.
Well, Tim, thanks for joining me on this episode of Further Upstream. This was one I have seen coming for a while, but it was just a tremendous privilege to talk with Colin Hansen about the life and legacy of Tim Keller. I think we're going to be talking about Tim Keller's work for years to come. And these debates are important debates to have. And I think he'd want us to have them. So yeah, I'm just so grateful for everything he did, and grateful that you've joined me here to talk a little bit about it. So thank you.
Absolutely. It was one of my favorite ones to do.